Most people remember George Harrison as the quiet Beatle, gentle, spiritual, soft-spoken, the last person you would ever expect to carry a grudge. He stood beside Lennon, McCartney, and a star as they created some of the greatest musical moments in history. Yesterday, Let It Be, Hey Jude. From the outside, George looked like the calm center of the storm, the one who kept his feet on the ground while the world shook around him. But behind that serenity lay a truth he kept buried for decades, a truth so painful that he would not reveal it until the age of 58. One of his own bandmates dragged him to his lowest point, humiliating him, dismissing him, and marking him in ways he carried until his final breath. When George finally told the world who he truly resented the most, it shattered everything fans thought they knew about the Beatles' brotherhood. To understand why the betrayal cut so deeply, we need to return to the beginning, to the childhood that shaped the boy who would one day become a Beatle, before the fame, before the screaming crowds, before the world called him the quiet one. George Harrison was just a small boy growing up in a cramped two-up, two-down house at 12 Arnold Grove. Born on February 25th, 1943, he spent his early winters in a home so cold that even indoors you could see your breath hang in the air. The toilet sat outside in the yard. The walls felt like they trapped more wind than warmth. But that tiny house held one extraordinary thing, a mother who saw something different in her youngest child. Louise Harrison, whose singing was so loud neighbors joked it rattled the windows, had a strange habit during her pregnancy. Every Sunday, she tuned the radio to Radio India, letting the hypnotic sound of sitars and tablas fill their little home. She believed those mysterious vibrations soothed the restless baby inside her. Years later, George admitted those sounds stayed in his bones. It already felt like destiny whispering to him. By the time he entered school, George loved drawing guitars in the margins of his notebooks, but the school felt like a prison. No music, no guitars, no space for a boy who lived half in daydreams. Everything changed one afternoon in 1956. Riding his bike, he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel blasting from a neighbor's window. He stopped pedaling. He said later that the sound hit him like an explosion, as if someone had cracked open a door to a world he didn't know existed. At 14, he begged his mother for a guitar. She bought one for $310 shillings, a fortune for their family. George played until his fingers bled. Skiffle music from Lonnie Donegan pushed him to form his first band, the Rebels. It was messy, loud, imperfect, and completely theirs. Then fate stepped in again. On the bus to school, George met a boy named Paul McCartney. Two kids, same bus route, same obsession with guitars. Paul would later call George his baby brother, but back then they were just two boys leaning over bus seats, teaching each other chords, dreaming about stages they had never seen. In 1958, Paul introduced George to John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen. John thought he looked too young. He looks about 12, John complained. But one night, on a bus lit only by a street lamp outside, George played a flawless lead part. John didn't say a word, but his silence meant everything. George was in. Three boys from Liverpool, armed with nothing but cheap guitars and impossible dreams. Unaware that ego, jealousy, and buried resentment would one day turn that brotherhood into a quiet war that left scars for life. When the Beatles reached the absolute peak of their fame, the world believed they were inseparable. Four young men fused together by talent, destiny, and brotherhood. But inside Abbey Road's Studio 2, something very different was happening, and the person George Harrison once admired the most slowly became the one who wounded him the deepest. For George, the tension with John Lennon didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, almost invisibly, during the mid-1960s. By then, George had begun writing songs he genuinely believed in, songs that reflected the growth he had fought so hard for. He brought If I Needed Someone into the studio with a rare sense of pride. John barely looked at it. "It's nothing," he said, not as feedback, but as dismissal. George went home in silence that night. He told Patty Boyd only one thing. John didn't even hear the song. That single moment revealed what he would face over and over again. As George grew, John seemed to pull away, almost as if he couldn't stand watching Harrison evolve into more than the kid brother he once was. When George embraced meditation and Indian spirituality, John didn't just mock him in private, he mocked him in front of the others. "You and your gurus, it's just another trap," he sneered. Ringo later said George's face looked like someone had stabbed him in front of the whole room. Things reached their breaking point during the Let It Be sessions. In the 2021 Get Back footage, you can see it clearly. George trying to explain a guitar idea, desperately trying to be heard. John stares off into the distance, ignoring him completely, as if George isn't even in the room. After an unbearable pause, George finally let everything spill out. Years of frustration compressed into a few words. "I'll play whatever you want, or I won't play at all." That was the moment the world first glimpsed the wound that Lennon had carved into him. But the real explosion didn't happen until 1973. John was in his chaotic lost weekend phase when he met George at a New York hotel. Everyone expected a reunion filled with nostalgia, warmth, maybe even laughter. Instead, when John casually suggested they perform together at Madison Square Garden, George snapped. He stood up, face burning, and shouted, "Where were you when I needed you?" Then he did something no one saw coming. He reached over, ripped the glasses off John Lennon's face, and threw them onto the floor. May Pang later wrote, "John froze, completely paralyzed. It was the only moment in his life where John Lennon was genuinely afraid of George Harrison." The quiet man had finally unleashed 10 years of swallowed humiliation, abandonment, and loneliness. And yet, he had no idea that the deepest, longest-lasting wound would come not from John, but from the man the world always assumed was his closest friend. For decades, fans believed that the real tension inside the Beatles was always between John and Paul, two giants competing for control. But the truth George finally revealed was far more painful, far more personal, and far more heartbreaking. Because the person George Harrison quietly resented until his final days was the man everyone assumed he was closest to, Paul McCartney. Their conflict wasn't explosive like George and John. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, quiet, and deeply wounding. The kind of pain that builds inside someone who feels invisible in the very place where he should have felt most alive. It began in the late 1960s, almost without anyone noticing. As the Beatles' sound grew more sophisticated, Paul began taking tighter and tighter control in the studio. Many saw it as perfectionism. To George, it felt like suffocation. He would bring in songs he had worked on for months, songs that carried heart, emotion, and the spiritual depth he had grown into. But Paul would rearrange them on the spot. often standing directly over George's shoulder, dictating exactly how to play a part. Jeff Emmerich, the engineer who watched it all happen, said Paul micromanaged George into the floor. George later confessed something brutally honest in a 1974 interview, a sentence he said only once. Paul ruined me as a guitarist. Not his skill, his confidence, Paul's constant corrections, constant criticism, constant direction. It crushed something inside him. If John ignored him, Paul overpowered him. The worst moment came during the recording of Maxwell's Silverhammer, a song nearly everyone in the band disliked. Paul insisted on take after take after take. After days of repetition, George whispered to Ringo, "Why are we doing this?" Paul overheard. His answer was cold, sharp, unforgettable, because it's my song. That tone, that crystal clear message, stayed with George for life. But the real fracture tore open during the Let It Be sessions. On the second day of filming, George finally pushed back. He told Paul, gently at first, that he didn't appreciate being told how to play every part. Paul replied, "I'm just trying to help you, George." George paused. And then came the most famous line of the entire documentary, the moment Beatles historians still call the purest honest moment ever captured on film. "You don't listen to anyone else." It was George's way of saying, "You don't see me, you don't hear me, you don't respect me." Even years later, the resentment remained. In 1987, when asked if he'd ever join a band with Paul again, George answered without hesitation, "I'd join a band with John, but not with Paul." He tried to pretend it was just musical, but everyone knew the truth. Even near the end of his life, George carried a wound Paul never fully understood. Not hatred, not anger, just a quiet ache from a friendship that was never equal, never balanced, and never truly healed. George Harrison's final chapter didn't begin in 2001. It began quietly years earlier, long before the public realized anything was wrong. By the late 1990s, George had already survived one battle with throat cancer, but the cancer returned, spreading to his lungs and later to his brain. Each diagnosis came like another shadow falling across the gentle Beatles' life. Yet even as his body weakened, his spirit refused to dim. During the most painful days, he continued working on the songs that would become his last album, Brainwashed. Danny, his son, remembered walking into the room to find George whispering melodies into a tape recorder. His voice was too weak to sing normally, but the music inside him refused to be silent. Every note felt like a race against time. His final gift to the world he felt he had never fully belonged to. As the treatments grew harsher and the doctor's expressions graver, George understood the truth before anyone had to speak it. He didn't want hospitals or machines. He wanted peace. He asked to be taken to Los Angeles, into a private home owned by security expert Gavin DeBicker, a place where he could spend his last days in serenity. The room was prepared the way George wanted. Soft light, fresh flowers, the gentle sound of devotional chanting, the same spiritual vibrations that had guided him since 1966, the same energy his mother had unknowingly passed to him by listening to Radio India all those years ago. As November 2001 drew to a close, George's breathing became slower, speaking became harder. Friends visited in small waves. Ravi Shankar sent messages. Tom Petty cried over the phone, and even Paul McCartney arrived to say goodbye. Their meeting was emotional, tender, and heavy with unspoken regret. two old friends who had hurt each other, yet still shared a bond no one on earth could understand. On November 29, 2001, surrounded by Olivia and Danny, George slipped into a quieter estate. His eyes softened, his breath grew shallow, his family recited verses from the Bhagavad Gita, the sacred text whose philosophy had shaped his heart and music. A final whisper left his lips, a private message to the people he loved most. And George Harrison drifted away. His ashes were later taken to India and released into the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in a discreet ceremony. It was exactly the farewell he wanted, simple, spiritual, eternal. But what came next astonished even those closest to him. George's legacy grew, not slowly but exponentially. The world rediscovered his brilliance. Here Comes the Sun became the most streamed Beatles song of all time, while My Guitar Gently Weeps, Something All Things Must Pass, all celebrated as masterpieces. He earned 2 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions. His concert for Bangladesh became recognized as the blueprint for modern charity concerts. Artists across generations began saying the same thing his son said. He followed his own path even when it hurt. George Harrison carried more pain than anyone ever realized. He endured wounds from friends he loved. He buried hurt so deep the world mistook him for silent. And yet, he forgave more than he was ever forgiven. Now you know the story he never said out loud. George Harrison never shouted for attention. He never demanded credit. He never fought for the spotlight, even when he deserved it more than anyone else in the room. And perhaps that is why his legacy shines brighter with each passing year. In the decades since his death, the world has begun to truly understand the depth of his soul. Not just the guitarist behind Lennon and McCartney, not just the quiet Beatle, but the man who carved an entirely new spiritual dimension into Western music, a man who blended rock with devotion, a man who turned pain into poetry, a man who wrote melodies that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Here comes the sun, something, while my guitar gently weeps, all things must pass. These are not just songs, they are emotional landscapes, places people return to when life feels overwhelming, when their hearts are heavy, or when they simply want to feel something real. George lived gently. He loved quietly, but he hurt deeply. He carried wounds from John's dismissals. He carried scars from Paul's control. He carried the loneliness of being the third writer in the greatest band on earth, yet still the most overlooked. And despite everything, he left the world with more peace than he ever received. Those who knew him best always said the same thing. George never stopped searching for something higher. And perhaps that is why his story continues to resonate today. He was proof that you can be soft and still strong. You can be kind and still wounded. You can be quiet and still unforgettable. He never said this sentence publicly, but it is the truth that echoed through his life. I just wanted to be seen, not as a Beatle, not as the quiet one, just as myself. And today, decades after his voice fell silent, the world finally sees him. George Harrison's legacy is not just in records or awards or headlines. It is in every musician he inspired, every listener he comforted, every heart he touched without ever raising his voice. George once said, "What all things must pass, but the beauty he left behind never will."